The ship came apart like paper in a storm. Metal screamed and fire bloomed in the darkness of space as the starward drift broke into pieces above the frozen world below. Emergency lights flashed red. Alarms filled every corridor with their terrible sound. And then came the fall. Danny Cole grabbed the wall as the floor tilted beneath him. He was a big man with rough hands and a face that had seen too many hard days. He had been a Marine once, a long time ago, and now he fixed engines on ships that traveled between stars. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was finding his sister. He pushed through the chaos, past crew members who ran and screamed and prayed to gods he did not know. The ship shook again, and he fell hard against a door frame. Pain shot through his shoulder, but he kept moving. He had to find Amy. She was in the medical bay when he found her. Amy Cole was smaller than her brother, with kind eyes and steady hands. She was already pulling supplies into a bag, working fast and calm while the world fell apart around her. When she saw Danny, she did not waste time with words. She just nodded and followed him. They found Pete Harmon near the escape pods. Pete was a thin man with glasses and a beard that never grew quite right. He studied rocks on distant worlds, but right now he was trying to open a jammed door with a metal bar. Danny helped him, and together they forced it open. The escape pod was small, too small for the number of people trying to get inside. Danny saw the aliens pushing and shoving, their strange bodies pressed together in fear. There were the tall reptiles with scales that shifted color when they were afraid. There were the insect-like creatures with hard shells and many legs. There were the thin and pale with eyes too large for their faces. And there was Old, the Elder, an amphibian creature who moved slowly and spoke even slower. Danny pushed his way through and got Amy inside first. Then Pete. Then he turned and grabbed the nearest alien, a young named, and threw him into the pod. He did the same for the others, one by one, until the pod was full. There was no more room. Danny looked at the remaining crew members still in the corridor. Their eyes were wide with terror. He wanted to save them all, but the pod could not hold them. Someone had to close the door. He closed it himself and hit the launch button. The pod shot away from the dying ship just as the main reactor exploded. The blast pushed them harder and faster toward the planet below. Through the small window, Danny watched the starward drift become a ball of fire and then nothing at all. The landing was bad. The pod hit the frozen ground at an angle and rolled 3 times before stopping. Inside, bodies were thrown against walls and each other. Danny felt something crack in his chest, maybe a rib, but he had felt worse. He forced his eyes open and looked around. Amy was bleeding from a cut on her head, but she was already moving, checking on the others. Pete was unconscious but breathing. The aliens were in worse shape. One of them had a cracked shell, leaking blue fluid. A named was not moving at all. Danny kicked open the pod door and cold hit him like a fist. It was the kind of cold that hurt, that burned, that reached into your bones and squeezed. He had been to cold places before. He had trained in mountains and Arctic bases during his Marine days. But this was something else. This was a cold that wanted to kill. He stepped outside and looked around. The world was white and gray and empty. Ice covered everything as far as he could see. The sky was pale and strange, with 2 small suns that gave light but no warmth. Wind cut across the flat ground, carrying snow that stung his face. Behind him, the others began to crawl out of the pod. The aliens shook and wrapped their arms around themselves. Their bodies were not made for this. Danny could see it in the way they moved, the way their skin changed color, the way their breathing became fast and shallow. Amy came to stand beside him. Her breath made clouds in the air. She looked at the frozen wasteland and then at her brother. She did not say anything. She did not need to. They both knew what this place was. This was a place where things died. Pete woke up a few minutes later, holding his head and groaning. When he saw the world outside, his face went pale. He was a scientist, and scientists understood numbers. He would know the temperature, the wind speed, the time until nightfall. He would know how long they had. The aliens gathered together, speaking in their own languages, their voices high and frightened. The young approached Danny with shaking hands. His scales had turned a sickly gray color. "Human," said, his voice trembling. "What do we do? My people cannot survive this cold. None of us can. We will die here." Danny looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the wreckage of the escape pod, at the pieces of metal and wire scattered across the ice. He looked at the pale sky and the distant suns. He felt the cold trying to crawl inside him, trying to slow his heart and freeze his blood. And then he did what humans have always done when the world tried to kill them. He started making a plan. "We need shelter," Danny said, his voice steady and calm. "We need heat. We need to not be out here when night comes." He turned to Pete. "How long until dark?" Pete looked at the sky, at the position of the two suns. His lips moved as he calculated. "Maybe 6 hours," he said. "Maybe less." Danny nodded. 6 hours. 6 hours to build something that could keep them alive on a world that wanted them dead. It was not much time. It was almost no time at all. But it was enough. It had to be enough. He walked to the wreckage and began to work. Amy joined him without being asked. Pete followed a moment later. The aliens watched them with confused eyes, not understanding what the humans were doing, not understanding why they moved with such purpose when death was so certain. The old elder watched longest of all. He had lived for 200 years. He had seen many species across many worlds, but he had never seen anything quite like this. He had never seen creatures look at certain death and simply refuse to accept it. The cold wind blew harder, and the suns began their slow fall toward the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, something howled, a sound like metal being torn apart. Night was coming to this frozen world, and night would bring a cold beyond imagination. But the humans kept working. They did not stop. They did not rest. They did not look at the coming darkness with fear. They built. Danny's hands bled as he worked. The metal was sharp and the cold made his fingers slow and clumsy. But he did not stop. He could not stop. Every minute that passed brought the night closer, and with it, a cold that would freeze them where they stood. Pete worked beside him, using a piece of broken pipe to dig into the frozen ground. The geologist understood what Danny was trying to do. A hole in the ground would protect them from the wind. Walls would hold in heat. A roof would keep out the snow. It was simple. It was basic. It was the same thing humans had been doing for 100,000 years. Amy moved between the aliens, checking their injuries and trying to keep them calm. The cracked shell was getting worse. Blue fluid leaked from the wound, no matter how many bandages she applied. The named had woken up but would not speak. He just sat on the ice and stared at nothing with his huge dark eyes. Tried to help the humans work. His reptilian body was already slowing down, his movements becoming stiff and jerky as the cold affected his blood. But he carried pieces of metal when Danny pointed at them. He held things in place when Pete needed an extra hand. He did not understand what they were building, but he understood that the humans had a plan, and that was more than anyone else had. The other, an older female named, stayed close to. She was trying to keep the elder warm with her own body, even though her own temperature was dropping fast. Watched the humans work with ancient eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. "They move with purpose," said softly, his voice like water over stones. "As if they have done this before." Shook her head. "They are wasting energy. We should conserve our strength and wait for rescue." "Rescue may not come," replied. "Or it may come too late. The humans understand this. They are not waiting to be saved. They are saving themselves." 3 hours passed. The suns fell lower. The temperature dropped degree by degree, and with each degree the aliens grew weaker. One of the named had stopped moving entirely. Amy checked on him and found his body had gone into a kind of hibernation, a last defense against the cold. She did not know if he would wake up again. But the shelter was taking shape. Danny had built a frame from bent metal poles ripped from the escape pod. Pete had dug a pit 2 feet deep and lined it with pieces of hull plating. Together, they covered the frame with sheets of metal, insulation fabric, and anything else they could find that would hold in warmth. The hardest part was the heating system. Danny knew they needed fire, but fire needed fuel. He searched through the wreckage until he found what he was looking for: the escape pod's emergency fuel cells. They were small, meant to power the pod systems for a few days, but they could also burn. They could produce heat. He built a simple stove from a metal container and connected it to the fuel cells with tubes and wire. It was ugly. It was dangerous. One mistake could blow them all to pieces. But when he lit it for the first time and felt that beautiful warmth spread through the tiny shelter, he smiled for the first time since the crash. "Inside," he called to the others. "Everyone inside now." The aliens moved slowly, their bodies fighting against the cold. Pete helped carry the hibernating. Amy guided, who walked like a sleepwalker, his mind somewhere far away, and came last, leaning on each other. The shelter was small, too small for 11 survivors. They pressed together, bodies touching bodies, sharing what little warmth they had. The smell was bad. The air was thin. But the temperature inside was above freezing, and that was enough to keep them alive. Outside, the suns disappeared below the horizon. The sky turned from pale gray to deep black in minutes, and then the true cold came. Danny stood at the shelter's entrance, which he had covered with a makeshift door of layered fabric and metal. He looked out through a tiny gap and watched the world transform. Ice crystals formed in the air itself, floating and glittering in the faint starlight. The wind died down, and in the silence, he could hear the ground cracking as it froze even harder. Pete checked the temperature gauge on his wrist device. His face went white. -140 degrees, he whispered, and still falling. At that temperature, exposed skin would freeze solid in seconds. Metal would become brittle as glass. The very air would begin to, if it got much colder. It was a cold beyond anything Earth had ever known. Sat in the corner of the shelter, his scales now completely gray, his eyes half closed. His body was shutting down, trying to survive by slowing everything to a crawl. He looked at Danny with something like wonder. "Human," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "How did you know to do this? How did you know to build a shelter instead of waiting to die?" Danny sat down across from him. The heater glowed between them, a small spot of warmth in an ocean of cold. He thought about the question for a long moment. "Where I come from," Danny said, "the winters were hard, not like this but hard enough. My grandfather used to tell me stories about the old days before humans had cities and machines. He said our ancestors lived through ice ages that lasted thousands of years. They survived by being stubborn, by refusing to give up, by looking at a world that wanted them dead and saying no. Did not seem to understand. But why? Why fight against nature itself? Would it not be easier to accept?" Danny shook his head. "Maybe, but that is not what humans do. We do not accept. We do not surrender. When the world gets cold, we build fires. When the land floods, we build boats. When there is no food, we find new ways to grow it. We have been fighting against nature since the first human stood up on 2 legs. It is what we are." Amy had been listening from nearby. She added her own words. "On Earth, we have a saying, 'What does not kill you makes you stronger,' but I think the truth is different. What does not kill you teaches you how to survive when it tries again." The night passed slowly. The heater worked, but it was not enough to make them comfortable. It was only enough to keep them alive. The aliens huddled together, their bodies cold but not freezing. The humans took turns watching the heater, making sure it did not fail, making sure the fuel kept burning. At some point during the long darkness, spoke. His voice was weak, but his words were clear. "I have studied humans," the old said. "I have read your histories, your stories, your songs. I thought I understood your species, but I was wrong. I understood the facts, but not the truth. The truth is that you are not just survivors. You are fighters. You fight against everything, even the universe itself." Danny looked at the ancient alien and said nothing. There was nothing to say. He was just a mechanic from a small town on Earth, a man who fixed engines and missed his home. He was not a hero. He was not special. He was just someone who refused to lie down and die. Outside, the frozen world waited. The temperature fell to negative 160 degrees. Ice covered everything. Nothing moved. Nothing lived. But inside the tiny shelter, 11 survivors breathed and waited for the dawn. They were cold and scared and hurt. They did not know if rescue would ever come. They did not know if they would survive another night. But they were alive, and as long as they were alive, there was hope. The humans had taught them that. Dawn came slowly to the frozen world. The two small suns rose together, painting the ice in shades of orange and gold. It was beautiful in a terrible way, like a painting of death made by a master artist. The temperature climbed back up to merely deadly levels, and the survivors began to move again. The first morning brought the first loss. Amy was checking on the named when she realized something was wrong. His hibernation had gone too deep. His body had tried to survive by slowing down, but it had slowed down too much. His heart had stopped sometime in the night, frozen in his chest like a stone. She told the others quietly. There were no tears, not because no one cared, but because tears would freeze before they fell. The other, whose name was, made a sound like breaking glass. It was the sound of grief in her species, a high keening that echoed across the empty ice. They buried in the frozen ground. Pete dug the grave with the same pipe he had used to build the shelter. It took 2 hours because the ground was harder than stone. When they were done, placed a piece of metal on top, scratched with symbols in the language. Danny watched the small funeral and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had saved them from the crash. He had built them a shelter. But it was not enough. The cold was still killing them, just slower than before. He made a decision. They could not just sit and wait. They had to make the shelter better. They had to find more fuel. They had to give themselves the best chance possible. Pete understood immediately. "The main wreckage," he said, pointing to the distant plume of smoke that marked where the starward drift had fallen. "There might be more supplies there, more fuel cells, maybe even a working beacon." The walk would be dangerous. It was at least 3 miles across open ice with no protection from the wind. But Danny had survived worse. At least he told himself he had. He left at midday when the suns were highest and the temperature was warmest. Amy wanted to come with him, but he made her stay. If something happened to him, the others would need her medical skills. Pete stayed too, to keep the heater running and protect the shelter. Danny wrapped himself in every piece of fabric he could find. He covered his face, his hands, his feet. He looked like a walking pile of rags, but he could feel the cold fighting to get through every gap and seam. The walk was hell. Each step was an effort. The ice was slippery and uneven, full of hidden cracks and holes. The wind picked up after an hour, throwing snow into his eyes and making it hard to see. His breath froze on the fabric covering his face, turning it into a mask of ice. But he kept walking, one foot after another, one step at a time. He thought about Amy waiting in the shelter. He thought about the aliens who would die if he failed. He thought about his grandfather's stories, about ancestors who had crossed frozen lands with nothing but stone tools and animal skins. If they could do it, so could he. The wreckage was worse than he expected. The main body of the starward drift had broken into 1,000 pieces on impact. Debris was scattered across a mile of ice, mixed with frozen bodies and burned metal. Danny tried not to look at the bodies. He tried not to think about the people he had known, the crew members he had worked beside for years. He searched through the wreckage for 3 hours. His fingers went numb, then painful, then numb again. He found food packets and medical supplies. He found extra fuel cells, more than enough to keep the heater running for weeks. And he found the emergency beacon, cracked but possibly repairable. He loaded everything into a bag made from torn fabric and started the long walk back. The suns were already falling toward the horizon. He had to move fast or the night would catch him in the open. Back at the shelter, the others were struggling. The who had stopped speaking had gotten worse. He sat in the corner and rocked back and forth, his huge eyes empty, his mind broken by the endless cold and the white emptiness of this world. His species had evolved on a planet of endless summer, where the temperature never dropped below pleasant warmth. This frozen hell was destroying him from the inside out. His companion, Merc, tried to help. He spoke too in their soft language, held his hands, reminded him of their home, but did not respond. He was lost somewhere inside himself, hiding from a reality too cold to bear. And were doing better, but only barely. Their reptilian blood had adjusted somewhat to the cold, entering a state of sluggish survival. They moved slowly and spoke little, conserving every bit of energy they had. Spent most of her time helping, whose ancient body was fighting hard just to keep breathing. The surviving had stopped eating. The death of had broken something in her. She sat by herself and stared at the wall, her multiple legs folded beneath her shell, her antennae drooping and still. Amy tried to get her to drink water but refused. When Danny returned at dusk, loaded with supplies, it felt like a small miracle. Amy cried when she saw him, though she quickly wiped away the tears before they could freeze. Pete helped him inside and took the bag of supplies, his face lighting up when he saw the fuel cells. "You did it," Pete said, amazement in his voice. "You actually did it." Danny collapsed against the shelter wall, too tired to speak. His body was screaming with pain. His lungs burned from breathing frozen air. His fingers and toes felt like they belonged to someone else. But he was alive. He had made it. That night, as the killing cold returned and the stars came out in their millions, the survivors gathered around the heater and shared the food Danny had found. It was not much, just emergency rations designed to keep people alive rather than satisfied. But it was warm, and after days of nothing, it felt like a feast. Looked at Danny across the small space. The old's eyes were tired but thoughtful. "Human," he said, "what drove you to walk through that frozen wasteland? You could have died. You almost certainly should have died. Why did you go?" Danny chewed his food slowly before answering. He was so tired that even thinking felt hard, but he found the words eventually. "Because staying here meant certain death," he said. "Going out there meant possible death. My grandfather taught me that when you have no good choices, you choose the one that gives you a chance. Any chance, no matter how small, is better than none." Was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke again, his voice soft with something like wonder. "In 200 years I have never met a species quite like yours. You do not simply survive. You rage against death itself. It is remarkable. It is terrifying. It is beautiful." Amy leaned against her brother's shoulder. She was tired too, tired in a way that went deeper than her bones. But she smiled at the old alien's words. "We do not know how to give up," she said. "It is not in our nature. Maybe it is a flaw. Maybe it is what keeps us alive. Either way, it is what makes us human." Outside, the wind howled and the temperature fell. Another night on the frozen world had begun. More darkness, more cold, more chances to die. But inside the shelter, the survivors held on. They shared warmth and food and hope. They told stories of their homes and their families. They remembered those they had lost and prayed for those still alive. And they waited for another dawn. The storm came on the 7th night. It came without warning, rising from the horizon like a white wall, swallowing the stars and bringing winds that screamed like dying animals. The temperature, already deadly, plunged even further. Inside the shelter, the survivors huddled together and listened to their tiny home shake and groan against the fury of nature. The heater failed at midnight. Danny woke to the sound of silence where there should have been the soft hum of burning fuel. He felt the cold immediately, crawling over his skin, seeping into his muscles, squeezing his heart. He scrambled to the heater in the darkness and found the problem immediately. The fuel line had frozen. Ice had formed inside the tube, blocking the flow of fuel to the heating element. Around him, the others were waking up to the terrible cold. The aliens made sounds of fear and pain. Their bodies, already pushed to the limit, began to shut down. Danny could hear their breathing becoming shallow and slow. "Pete," Danny shouted, "get me a light." Pete fumbled in the darkness and found a small emergency torch. Its pale beam cut through the black, showing Danny the extent of the problem. The fuel line was completely blocked. He would have to take it apart, clear the ice, and put it back together. In the dark, in the freezing cold, with numb fingers that could barely feel. He started working. There was no other choice. Amy moved through the shelter, checking on the survivors. What she found made her heart break. The young who had tried so hard to help had stopped breathing. His scales had turned pure white, the color of deep cold in his species. His eyes were open but saw nothing. He had died in his sleep, his cold blood finally giving up the fight. Let out a wail of grief when she saw him. She tried to warm his body with her own, but it was already stiff and frozen. Another loss, another friend taken by this terrible world. The died next. She had been weak for days, refusing food, refusing water, refusing to fight. The cold took her quietly, peacefully, like a candle flame going out. Amy closed her eyes and covered her with a piece of fabric. There was nothing else to do. The broken was still alive, but barely. His body had given up even if his heart had not. He lay on the ground, his huge eyes staring at nothing, his chest barely moving. Merc held him close and whispered in their language, words of love and comfort that no one else could understand. And still Danny worked. His fingers were blue, his lungs screamed with every breath. The cold was inside him now, slowing his thoughts, making his movements clumsy and uncertain. But he kept going. He took apart the fuel line piece by piece. He used his own breath to melt the ice, feeling the warmth leave his body with every exhale. He put the pieces back together with hands that shook so badly he dropped them twice. Amy came to help. She held the torch and steadied his hands when they shook too much. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence was enough, a reminder that he was not alone, that there was someone counting on him. Pete worked on the other end, checking the fuel cells, making sure they were still working. He found that one had cracked in the cold, leaking precious fuel into the frozen ground. They were down to their last 2 cells. If those failed, there would be nothing left. Outside, the storm raged on. The walls of the shelter bent inward with each gust of wind. Snow forced its way through gaps and cracks, piling up in small drifts inside their tiny home. The temperature inside had dropped to well below freezing. Everyone was dying. Danny finished the repair at 3 in the morning. He connected the last piece and prayed to whatever gods might be listening on this frozen world. Then he pressed the ignition switch. Nothing happened. He pressed it again, and again, and again. His hands were shaking, his vision was blurring. The cold was pulling him down into darkness. Then, with a soft sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence, the heater ignited. A tiny flame appeared, then grew. Heat began to radiate outward, pushing back the killing cold. Danny collapsed. He could not move, he could not even feel his body anymore. He was just a mind floating in a sea of cold and pain, but he had done it. He had fixed the heater. He had kept them alive for one more night. Amy was there immediately, wrapping him in fabric, rubbing his hands and feet, trying to bring the blood back to his frozen limbs. She was crying, but she was also smiling. Her brother had done the impossible. Again. The dawn came slowly, pale and cold. The storm had passed, leaving behind drifts of snow piled against the shelter walls. Inside, the survivors took stock of what they had lost. And were gone. Their bodies lay covered in the corner, frozen and still. Was alive but unconscious, his body in a state somewhere between sleep and death. Was weak but breathing, her scales slowly regaining some color in the returning warmth. Was alive too, his ancient body having somehow survived yet another night. Merc sat beside, holding his friend's hand. He had not slept all night. He had just stayed there, watching, waiting, hopping. When Amy checked on, Merc looked up at her with exhausted eyes. "Will he live?" Merc asked. Amy did not know how to answer. His body was failing. His mind had retreated so far from reality that it might never come back, but she could not tell Merc that, not after everything they had been through. "He is fighting," she said. "As long as he is fighting, there is hope." Merc nodded slowly. It was not the answer he wanted, but it was the truth. Fighting was all any of them could do. Danny woke up in the afternoon, his body aching in ways he had never felt before. His fingers were wrapped in bandages where the cold had damaged the skin. His lungs hurt with every breath, but he was alive. Pete sat beside him, looking exhausted but relieved. "You did it," he said. "You saved us, again." Danny shook his head slowly. "I just fixed a heater, nothing special." "Nothing special," Pete almost laughed. "You fixed a heater in the dark in a blizzard with frozen hands while everyone around you was dying. That is not nothing. That is everything." Had been listening from nearby. The old raised himself up on one arm and looked at Danny with eyes that had seen 2 centuries of life. "Human," said, his voice weak but clear. "I asked you once why your species fights against nature. You said you did not know, but I think I know now. I think you fight because you cannot imagine doing anything else. Surrender is not in your blood. Giving up is not in your soul. You are built to struggle, to fight, to survive against all odds. It is what makes you dangerous. It is what makes you wonderful." Danny did not know what to say. He was just a mechanic from Earth, a man who had learned to fix things because breaking them was too easy. He was not a hero. He was not special. But he had kept 11 people alive through the worst night of their lives. And even though 4 of them had died, the rest were still breathing, still fighting, still hopping. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. The suns moved across the sky, bringing what little warmth they could. The survivors rested and recovered and mourned their dead. And outside, the frozen world waited, patient and cold, ready to try again. But the humans were ready too. They had been ready since the first ice age. They would be ready for whatever came next. Because that was what humans did. They survived. 14 days. That was how long they survived on the frozen world. 14 days of cold and darkness and death. 14 days of fighting against a planet that wanted nothing more than to freeze them into statues and bury them under ice. 14 days that felt like 14 years. Pete fixed the emergency beacon on the 10th day. He worked with frozen fingers and failing tools, using pieces of wire and broken circuits, putting together something that should not have worked but did. The signal it sent was weak, barely a whisper in the vastness of space, but it was enough. On the 14th day, rescue came. Danny saw the ship first. He had been outside, gathering more debris to strengthen the shelter walls, when he noticed a light in the pale sky. At first, he thought it was a trick of his tired eyes, a hallucination brought on by cold and exhaustion. But the light grew larger and brighter, and soon the shape of a ship became clear. He ran back to the shelter, his damaged lungs screaming with every breath. "Ship!" he shouted, bursting through the makeshift door. "There is a ship coming." The survivors stirred from their exhausted sleep. Amy looked at him with disbelief, then hope, then joy. Pete started laughing, a strange sound in that tiny frozen space, closed his ancient eyes and whispered something in his own language, words that sounded like prayer. The last surviving made a sound like singing. It was the first sound of happiness any of them had heard since the crash. Merc wept openly, still holding his unconscious hand. His friend had survived barely, clinging to life by a thread so thin it could have broken at any moment. The rescue ship was called the Silver Dawn, a patrol vessel that had picked up the beacon signal 3 days earlier. Its captain was a gray-haired woman named Commander Julia Hayes. She had searched for survivors without much hope, expecting to find only frozen bodies and scattered wreckage. What she found instead was impossible. The rescue team landed near the shelter, their environmental suits protecting them from the deadly cold. They approached the crude structure with confusion on their faces. It was made of bent metal and torn fabric, held together with wire and hope. It should not have existed. It should not have kept anyone alive. But when they opened the door, they found 7 survivors, 3 humans, one elder, and one more who was unconscious but still breathing, still fighting, still refusing to die. Commander Hayes looked at the shelter, at the survivors, at the small heater that had kept them alive through 2 weeks of frozen hell. She had been in space for 30 years. She had seen many things, but she had never seen anything like this. How, she asked. It was the only word she could find. Danny was too tired to explain. He just shook his head and let Amy and Pete guide him toward the rescue ship, but spoke up, his ancient voice carrying across the frozen ground. "The humans," said, his words slow and deliberate. "The humans built this shelter. The humans kept the fire burning. The humans refused to let us die, even when death was certain. I have lived for 200 years, Commander. I have studied many species across many worlds, but I have never seen anything like the humans." Commander Hayes looked at Danny, at Amy, at Pete. They were damaged and exhausted, barely able to stand. Their skin was pale, their eyes shadowed, their bodies marked by the terrible cost of survival. But they were alive, and so were the aliens they had protected. "I need to hear this story," the commander said. The rescue ship lifted off from the frozen world as the suns began to set. Through the viewport, Danny watched the ice field shrink beneath them, becoming small and distant and finally disappearing entirely. The shelter he had built was down there somewhere, a tiny mark on a world that covered most of its surface with death. Inside the ship, the survivors were treated by medical staff. Wounds were cleaned and bandaged. Frozen tissue was carefully warmed. Food and water were given to bodies that had been pushed beyond all reasonable limits. It would take weeks to fully recover, maybe longer for some of them. Woke up on the second day of the journey home. He opened his huge dark eyes and looked around in confusion, not understanding where he was or how he had gotten there. Merk was beside him immediately, explaining everything, crying with relief. When understood what had happened, he asked to see the humans. Merk brought him to the small room where Danny and Amy were resting. Pete was there too, reading a technical manual about starship engines, already thinking about his next job. Stood in the doorway for a long moment, his tall, thin body still weak from the ordeal. Then he bowed, a deep formal bow that meant respect and gratitude in his culture. "You saved my life," said. "I do not remember much of those terrible days. My mind had gone somewhere else, somewhere far from the cold and the fear. But I know that I would have died without you. I know that you kept fighting when I could not." Danny did not know how to respond. He was not used to gratitude. He was not used to being seen as a hero. He was just a man who had done what needed to be done. "We helped each other," Danny said finally. "That is all anyone can do." Came later alone. She sat beside Danny and was quiet for a long time. Then she spoke, her reptilian voice rough with emotion. "I lost everyone," she said. "Was like a son to me. I watched him die and could do nothing. I wanted to give up. I wanted to let the cold take me too, but you would not let me. You kept the fire burning. You kept us moving. You gave us a reason to survive." She reached out and took Danny's hand in her scaled fingers. Her grip was weak but sincere. "I do not know if I will ever understand humans," said, "but I will always be grateful for them." On the last day of the journey, Commander Hayes called all the survivors to the observation deck. The stars stretched out before them, countless points of light in the infinite darkness. Somewhere among them was Earth, the small blue world where humans had learned to survive ice ages and fires and floods and everything else nature had thrown at them. "I have filed my report," the commander said. "The story of what happened on 7 will be told throughout the fleet. People will know what you did. They will know how 3 humans built a shelter from nothing and kept 7 beings alive for 2 weeks in conditions that should have killed everyone in hours." She turned to Danny, Amy, and Pete. Her eyes were warm with respect. "I do not know how you did it," she said. "I do not know where you found the strength, but I know this. You are what humanity is supposed to be. You are the best of us." Danny looked at his sister and his friend. They were tired and enchanged forever by what they had been through. But they were alive, and so were the aliens they had fought so hard to save. That night Danny stood alone at the viewport, staring out at the stars. Amy found him there, as she always did. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he pointed at the darkness between the stars, at the endless void that held so many dangers and so many wonders. "I am thinking about all the frozen hells out there," he said. "All the impossible worlds where nothing should survive. And I am thinking that somewhere, someday, humans will find them. And when we do, we will build fires. We will build shelters. We will refuse to die." Amy leaned against his shoulder, looking at the same stars, sharing the same thought. "That is what we do," she said. "It is what we have always done. It is what we will always do." The ship sailed on through the darkness, carrying its survivors toward home. Behind them, the frozen world turned slowly in the cold light of its 2 small suns. The shelter still stood on the ice, a monument to stubbornness and will and the refusal to accept the unacceptable. Someday the ice would bury it. Someday no trace would remain, but the story would live on. The story of how humans looked at certain death and said no. The story of how they built a fire in the coldest place in the galaxy and kept it burning until rescue came. It was a human story. It was the most human story of all. And it would never be forgotten.